So Ashley asked me a couple months ago to do a lunch and learn on SSR because it seems like it's something that is gradually kind of landing on the radar. We've done for a couple content sites that seem to be in the pipeline, and then it seems to also be like kind of in the future of what we might be doing with their applications. So here we are. The title, which Brandon chose, is SSR does everything does everything your SPA does, but way better. In my subtitle is the time to stop sabotaging user experience with irresponsibly and possibly large quantities of client-side JavaScript is now. With the asterisk, this statement is not an opinion and therefore exonerated from the Rocket Insights loosely held ethos. All right.
Wait, it's not an opinion?
Not an opinion.
It's a fact?
It's a fact. We only deal in facts now. I think the best compliment I've ever received was when I was talking to Ashley and we were at coffee one day and he said, "You're an opinionated bastard." And I was like, all right, I'm going to take that to heart. I don't deal in facts now. I don't deal in opinions anymore. So real quick, there's 3 parts of this thing. I'm actually going to start a timer because I figure I can do all of them in like under 12 minutes, which means we can kind of do this whole thing under 30 minutes with some chat. I'll put that on. There we go. So everyone here is obviously totally competent, and the last thing you need me to do is bore you to death just talking through the APIs of Nuxt and Next. You can do that on your own time. Furthermore, if I just say, hey, this is the hot new thing and I'm super opinionated and I kind of do the whole thought leader thing where you say, well, Scott likes this, so it must be good. We just end up in the place we are right now, which is we just have more opinions and everything burns. So I broke this into 3 parts where we're going to kind of talk a little bit deeper about how we got to where we are, which is how we broke the internet. Part 2 is going to be the SSR solutions. We're going to be sort of framework agnostic. We're going to look at Nuxt and Next, and we're just going to talk about like not the entirety of their API, but specifically how they're trying to solve the problems with traditional applications and the problem with SPAs. And then thirdly, we're going to shut the door and Bryn's going to pull out his gravity bong. And we're going to go right off the deep end. And we're going to address the age-old question of, is a burger a sandwich? And a variety of related questions, which if you hang on for this part, I think, I sent my slides to Brandon, I think I drive it home. It is truly relevant to what it means to be a good software developer. We're going to go way out there and then we're going to come snapping right back in.
My favorite part of this whole thing.
I think it's going to be the best part. Ultimately, my goal here is to entertain. So if we laugh and we have a good time, you think this dude is a space cadet, that would be satisfactory to me. All right. So part 1, starting my timer, 12 minutes. We broke the internet. I think everyone kind of knows this at this point. It's absolute chaos. So the thing that's great about the internet that is different from native apps or native desktop apps or iOS apps, whatever, is that it's this beautiful, decentralized modular thing. And everyone can just do whatever they want. You know, you can put up the Real Ultimate Power website, or you can be Bank of America, you can be Discover, you can be whatever, any of our clients. Everyone can do whatever they want and throw it up there, and there's no gatekeepers to deploying anything you want, a website, application, or anything else. And no one owns it either. So this whole thing is just built off of consensus of a variety of competitive and non-competitive forces. And it's this beautiful thing. Sounds idyllic, right? Well, the problem is that when we have this thing that nobody owns, as things change over time, users' needs change, the hardware and software we're using changes, the controls we need and the elements that we need as engineers need to change as well. And unlike... Oh.
I'm sorry. No,
so the problem is that unlike if you were looking at Apple or something where they're totally gate-kept and they can just do whatever they want on an annual cycle, we have these opaque standards bodies, which is like a secret cabal of people that no one knows what they do and where they work and what they do when they go to work every single day. And there's just people from Mozilla and Google and Apple and Facebook, and all these people are getting these secret rooms and they debate what we should do with the platform. So what happens is that because these people are kind of competitive, they don't achieve consensus very often. And when they do, all these browsers have to reach intent to implement. And then when they finally do implement, we have people that are still running IE11. And so if you look at something that some control you want to use that sounds great, you have to wait like 3.5 years until you can kind of do something with it, until then you have to polyfill. So it becomes absolutely miserable. So real quick example here, because this is all pretty abstract. I live by my reminders on the iOS app, Apple Reminders. And then if you go to iCloud.com, they actually tried to implement their reminders as a web interface. So I'm going to play the run because I don't know who's on the phone. But when we all look at this, just out of curiosity, who here, by a show of hands, looks at this and says, this is going to be hard? Nobody, right? Well, I mean, what is it like? It's like 4 lists of reminders and I got to pay my bills and whatever. Like, how hard could this possibly be? Should be a piece of cake. Well, when we start to look at it, what happens? Because we're building on web. Right out the gate.
You mean like hard to build? Hard to
build, yeah. Oh, should I ask it again? How many people think it's going to be hard to build? If you're that's the design you got from a designer, you're building a web application, you got to build that thing. Anyone look at that and go, "Ooh, this is daunting."
Yeah, but that's
No. Okay, we'll give you a pass. But anyway, most people I think would look at that and say, "I don't see what the problem is." So then we start to dive in a little bit, and you have this header. And you have the chevron reminders thing on the left, and you have my name on the right. And right out the gate, we have, 2 custom controls. We don't have modality APIs in the web, so all we can do is fix position or sort of like absolute position and Z layer this DOM, just jam it in there somewhere. And then, you have to kind of build this thing from scratch where you have this border, but you need to actually hit the chevron where that little caret thing points up. And then as the viewport changes, sometimes that needs to be to the bottom or the left or the right. And then the caret itself needs to be moved around. And then furthermore, you need to dismiss it. So now you have to add a click away with a JavaScript event somewhere, probably anywhere in the DOM, so that you can actually make the thing go away without having to click reminders, which is the way they did it. And now you start to see our perf budget start chipping away at that thing and the complexity of the state. We know when these things are open, when they're closed. Now we have client-side state, and we start to write JavaScript, chip away at our budget. Okay, it's kind of a pain in the ass if you got there from a designer, but totally manageable. The next thing you do is say, well, okay, I don't want to do the whole server lap as I'm moving from one list to the other list. That's kind of tedious. I have to rebuild the entire page. So why don't I try routing in the client? Okay, so now we're going to route the client. So when I go from personal to groceries, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hack the browser history so I can change the URL so that I can go from personal to groceries. And now I have route state. I need to know where I am because I need to style the links to indicate which page I'm actually on. Furthermore, if I'm on personal, and this is all in JavaScript, I have to asynchronously request all of my items. And I'm probably going to stick them in a global store somewhere because when I go in the client to go over to groceries, I'm going to asynchronously request those and stick those in the store. And I probably want to memorize this stuff to have to go back to personal. I don't want to make that fetch again, probably. So now that's stuff to sit there. And so now we can see, well, more JavaScript, a little more chipping away at the perf budget. Now we have a new type of state. We have router state complexity. And now we actually have the items we're requesting from the server. This is the part where I see the word app. I'm building an app. This is when this word creeps in. It's not a website, it's an app. Okay, semantics aside, we all feel like we're doing something cool. Isn't this great? Well, kinda. But then we should start to work our way through the rest of the UI. And now we have custom controls and modality. We have async behavior. And then we have various render logic. And slowly but surely, it just gets more and more complicated. Obviously, when I'm clicking that to-do item, it's not like a form with a submit button. So it's sort of implicit that when I check off my to-do, I'm going to send out an asynchronous request behind the scenes. And then I might be optimistic and have the UI locally reflect that it's checked off and then only handle the failure of that promise. We have another kind of modality that's a little bit different on the middle image, but then when you click that, now we have a full screen modality with a Z layer opacity, which you can kind of see that covers the whole DOM. Then when you change the color and you hit done, again, you're probably going to be optimistic. You have to update whether or not the list is orange or blue or what the icon is. And so slowly but surely, this gets more and more and more complicated. And when you think to yourself, okay, I got a lot of JavaScript we've got to write, and I have ever increasing amount of state complexity right out of the gate, not even talking about where this is going to go over time. So how do we solve this problem? NPM install, right? This is what we do. I'm not going to write this stuff from scratch. It's impossible. So I'm just going to install all my favorite packages, and we get this. Everyone knows this, right? the abyss that is node modules, which if you tried to actually copy your local directory from one place to another, you'd have to sit there for like 10 minutes. Or npm install, you go out, you get lunch, you come back, everything's there. And this is what happens because we're not going to write this stuff from scratch. We don't actually have the APIs and the controls that we need. And so we just install all of this third-party stuff, which is not meant to work together. No one's looking at the horizontal of this thing. Everyone's just focusing on their one package. And you end up with this absolutely insane bundle where no one even knows what is in there, which, okay, maybe it's not that big of a deal, right? It's a little bit heavy. Dave-O is here. This is for Dave-O. I'll say that. Until start to quantify the output. And this is when you get this. That's actually, I'm pretty sure this is the case. I don't even think they support mobile. So if you wanted to use the web interface, I don't even think they let you. I think you have to be on the desktop. And so the performance just shatters. And the number of times I've seen this, I've just lost count, where I just go and I try and look at what the user analytics are and I try to understand how long does it take to someone to actually load this site and use it. And the Lighthouse scores are so abysmal. This is actually not from the reminders, by the way. I didn't do this. This is from the other talk I gave where we did the Jira backlog, where when we just did what I think we did iPhone 6 with a 3G connection or something. It was like, cool. Wait 30 seconds to actually load up a list of whatever, 50 items. So your bundle is actually shattering the user experience. This is the grasping at straws phase. We're going to do like Brotli compression. That was a big one last year. I know we'll just jam this thing really, really tight so we can decrease the time going over the wire, but it's still the same amount of JavaScript that needs to get unpacked and parsed and then actually executed. Then the best one is when we start to do route splitting and lazy loading, which is basically saying, I want to render on I want to route on the client, but that doesn't work. So then I'll route split so I don't have to pull all my code at once, which is essentially just doing what the internet does by default. And there's no way that this is actually going to fix the problem at scale. Given enough time, if you try to do this, you're just going to be spending all of this time trying to rebuild what we get for free from the internet. Meanwhile, users are becoming more and more and more and more miserable if you had to actually live the life of the user, not the life of the developer in a developer environment. While you're doing all this, there's all this other stuff which no one is talking about, which is really important. There's so much stuff that actually needs to get done and get done well that really impacts your users. And they really don't care whether you're routing on the client, and they really don't care for the most part whether or not you're doing all sorts of crazy custom controls. They just want you to solve their problems, and this stuff actually matters to them in terms of how they use the application.
Is keyboard viability like being able now?
Yeah, if you want to, let's say you wanted to use your keyboard, or even if you couldn't use your keyboard, like that's what we're talking about. Like, can you actually use this thing without a mouse? Is it even possible, right? And I'm going to go through each one of these, but we'll just put this on the never-ending list of concerns that seem to get overlooked by most of the web applications that we, the industry, are building. So this is what I say. It can't be done. It's not possible to try to take single-page applications like we've been trying to build them and scale them and have them be the type of thing that you want to build over time. If you think, oh, this is Scott, the dude who spams dev reading, no one really listens to what he has to say, he's kind of crazy, ignore him. That's fine. Don't worry. This tweet was from Dan Abramoff in November of 2019. I'm just going to read it. This is my second favorite tweet of all time. Reading some Redux example code I wrote 4 years ago, and I have no effing idea what's going on there. I just want to fetch some dates. Geez, that's not saying anything bad about the folks working on it. I know they put a lot of work into it, blah, blah, blah. It's just a bit of a culture shock if you haven't been living in that world, and by a bit, I mean a whole effing lot. So Dan Abramoff was the original salesman of Redux when he worked on it. Him and Andrew Clark, I believe, and this is him saying, I don't know what's going on here. I'm looking at my own code. This doesn't make any sense. So at this point, people that are still not sold on the fact that it can't be done are probably saying, yeah, well, we have context now. No one really cares about Redux. We all kind of dump on it. All right, we'll go a little bit further. This is Ryan Florence. Does anyone know who Ryan Florence is? React Router, which is the only router really that's viable for React single-page applications. And he has been selling workshops for 5 years. That's what he does for a living. He said this in October. This is my favorite tweet of all time in engineering. I'm going to put some emphasis in here because I just love this. There's a chance I believe client-side routing on the web is usually not preferred, which is ironic. Might be best for screens where the majority of the UI persists, which is the edge case. Browsers handle page transitions really well. Still working through my thoughts. Go next one. I've personally had ambitious goals, but the SPAs I use that are written in React and React Router and similar client-routed frameworks are delivering a worse experience than if I just rendered on the server. I just server rendered and mounted a single feature app at that route, blah, blah, blah. I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. Okay. So the guy who is selling you the routing library is saying, maybe we shouldn't even do this. Meanwhile, he and his partner, Michael Jackson, are still promoting the next version of React Router. So I don't know what you would make of that if the person who's working the library says maybe you shouldn't even do this, but you don't need to listen to me. That should be like a big red flag that maybe we've been listening to the wrong people across the entire industry. So,
This is fine.
13, this is fine. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. That was 12 minutes.
Writing that at 1:30 in the morning, so
No, I didn't delete it. It's still up there. You should have pinned it. All right, so that was 12 minutes. Everyone not totally bored or asleep yet? Still here? All right, cool. All right, I'll stop there. Anyone have any questions, opinions, or anything like how we want to say so far about the internet? It can't be done and we broke the internet. No? All right, onward. Preach. All right, SSR solutions. So, obviously, for the people who've done like Rails development, traditional server-side rendering applications, this is kind of the old way it used to work, where you'd have all this stuff in the server, and then if you were a UI developer, you'd have to kind of work with your server team. You have to use, I don't know, whatever, like Twig or some templating engine, and then you would send just HTML and CSS, and so you would route and fetch and render on the server, send down only HTML and CSS to the DOM, and then from there, you'd have a little bit of JavaScript that would like bind the body on load and do some DOM manipulation, maybe some async stuff. And that was how it worked. You just built these CRUD apps through. Yeah.
I'm really glad you used the Firefox logo to represent the browser there.
That was
something else.
Thank you. That was intentional, by the way. That was intentional.
This to me, by the way, I have no idea what that is.
Really? Well, funny. So there's this guy. Who's this guy? So in the podcast, when I refer to tech as the postmodern hellscape, Adam chimed in. We were talking about the old way with server rendering, and he said, yeah, okay, Rails worked and it was fine, but it's cumbersome and you end up with multiple sources of truth. The more interactivity that you have in the client, you're writing JavaScript to mutate the DOM, but then you're also having render logic to deal with the DOM in some server language as well. Kind of complicated. And then every time you want to go from one page to the other, you got to do the full server lap, and that's a super bummer. And it used to be expensive. It's not so much anymore, but it used to be. So this guy, he has a point. We should all acknowledge it. It is cumbersome and it is problematic. So then we started doing this. What do we do here? We took a big hunk of the complicated stuff that we used to do on the server, and we said, we'll duplicate a whole bunch of it and then take some of that complicated stuff and we'll just send an atom bomb of JavaScript down to Firefox, and we'll just do that all in Firefox. And for all of the reasons I just mentioned for the simplest of to-do apps, that starts to create all sorts of externalities downstream of your architecture that you cannot possibly solve. This guy has an opinion too. And this guy, as we said multiple times, says, hey, so you realize you are like replicating your entire database in Redux, which is kind of what we do. Because when you're going from one route to another route on the client, you have to start to make these decisions like, do I want to fetch again? Do I want to store this stuff? I mean, you essentially become, when not done well, and it's very hard to do well, if at all, you essentially are becoming like a DBA and a backend programmer in the browser in JavaScript. All right. And this guy has a point. So we have these two kind of extremes, the traditional way and then the insane way. And somewhere in between this, we have the SSR way. I'm just going to sit this up for a minute. This is the best way I could try to make like a visualization of what's actually happening. You have your server, and then you have the browser, and then you have this other server in between. And your front end has a server, but it's not the server. So I guess I'll just stop there. Is that intuitive to everybody?
No.
All right. So think of it this way. Let's just say Principe is writing me a backend. Well, I need a server to balance out the load that I'm doing when I'm like fetching and rendering, doing all that stuff on the UI. but I don't want to write it in Rails. I want to write it in JavaScript, and I don't want my code and my deployment to be married to his API. So I need a server, but I don't want it to be this to handle some of my UI load, but I don't want it to be the server that Principe is writing his API in. Does that make sense? So I spin up my own server and I use an isomorphic framework. And so I'm still writing my front end, but my front end has a server that balances some of the load that I would otherwise be jamming into the browser. Does that make more sense?
So you're actually advocating for an API as it exists today with an extra architectural layer that is the SSR server, so to speak.
If you need to build dynamic user experiences that have a heavy reactivity on the client and heavy business logic on the client, the SPA won't scale, but that's the type of thing where I would say this is probably a better solution. If you're doing a traditional Rails app with CRUD stuff, you can just get by the traditional way. It's totally fine. When the traditional way doesn't work, skip right over the SPA way and come here. And so I'm going to say it like 100 times. Route, fetch, render. This is the stuff that you're doing on your front end server. Route, fetch, render, and then you send HTML and CSS down to the client and you hydrate it with the minimum amount of JavaScript needed to make the DOM interactive. Does that all make sense? All right.
So does this suggest like a full like server round trip?
Say that again?
Does this like require like a full server round trip every time like you were to click a link, or does the single page application in this context kind of like take over all the routing once the
Good
first?
question. Brandon and I had a partially philosophical conversation on this because it's kind of both, which we can really go into the weeds of the API, but we're going to get to that in a minute. I'll touch on that, and then I can send out some links afterwards so you can really understand how it works. Great question, though.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to derail.
What do we do on the server? Say it with me. Route, fetch, and render. It doesn't have to be the server, can be a server, but route, fetch, and render on the server. You know what this guy says? He likes it. He slacked me before this and he said, good luck on the lunch and learn, win one for the team. Now, he obviously doesn't build UI and I don't do backend, but we are aligned in our ideological vision of how to actually scale software applications. So we're like peanut butter and jelly, you know? We're made for each other. All right. So route, fetch, render, route, fetch, render. On the left is the MIT app. This is Nuxt, and on the right is Moody's. That was just a very small single page website that we just spun up, and I like threw it up on Zeit in like 10 minutes. And what you can see is that routing, you don't actually have a router. You don't define your routes. There's a directory called pages because the web is built off of web pages. And in that pages directory, you make a JavaScript file. So for example, on the left, we have events, and on the right, we have like index.js, and the router is built dynamically behind the scenes based on the JavaScript file you throw in pages. So if you want to add a new page, you just call newpage.js, you throw in that directory, and Bob's your uncle, you're routing. So you're not supposed to do all of this stuff behind the scenes, all this stuff like deep in the weeds of pulling in a routing library. It just does it for you. And you'll notice that these APIs, because Chrome team is working with both of these to try and guide where we're going, they are mirrors of one another. If I hop into a Next app, I hop into a Nuxt app, just go to the pages directory. Here's my route. I just open the folder and you can see it. Oh, to the question that was just asked, whoever asked that. There's a little bit of magic. That's way in the API weeds. Actually, I'm going to come back to that if we have time, because I'll be talking for like 10 minutes on that. Sure. All right, on fetching, when you're fetching on the server, there's two APIs when you're building a page. On the left, it's called async data, and on the right, it's called get initial props. And so what essentially happens is you're building a page, it's called article, in the presence of you exercising the API called async data. What that's saying is that I can't statically compile this because it's data dependent. So before I actually send HTML, CSS down to the client, we're going to pass through this method. I'm going to resolve one or more promises. You can see we have a couple here. I'm going to return that data to my template. I'm going to template on the server, and then HTML, CSS down to the client, and the minimum JavaScript needed for client-side interactivity. Same thing on the right. Who wrote this code? I forget who wrote that. Was it Colin, I think?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote a bunch of HTML, then Colin added the initial props here, and you can see there's just async function that's getting some CMS content. And that just becomes accessible, and you can just pass it down to all of the child components in the views on your given page. And then on rendering, same thing that you would see more or less as if you were building a single page application in React or Vue. On the left, we have a beautiful Vue template with its purity and its retaining of the web component spec, where it keeps kebab case for HTML props and it has directives. And on the right, we have this awful Lambda function that has these weird, camel case JavaScripty things, but it also has style JSX, which is actually kind of close to the web component API as well. But that's an opinion, by the way. When you look at these two on either side, it's the same sort of thing. You're routing on the server, and then you're fetching on the server, and then you render on the server, and then you hydrate the client. And they are so close that if you move between them, it should be like nothing. You know every place that everything is. While you're working on product and not trying to split the atom in JavaScript with a single page application, you get all of this other stuff for free out of the box. So you can just work on the product and just work on user experiences. I'm not going to list them all. You can read them on your own time. But the point is, there's all sorts of stuff. Like a really good example is differential loading. Right now, most of our apps that we've been building, we are just transpiling ES 2020 into old code and just giving it to everyone, even if they don't need it. Differential loading is going to make the determination what the user agent is and which bundle they need. Stuff like that you're not even thinking about that will just do for you, that is not your problem to solve. One other thing I was going to call out, the static file serving. Some of your pages in your app are probably mostly static. And what's great about this is when you don't use async data, when you don't use get initial props, when you build, it knows that it's not data dependent. It'll just statically compile it like it's a static page. We have a couple like terms and condition pages and a couple other things in these apps where it just builds it and sends it down. So it doesn't depend on anything. So there's no reason not to actually compile it all at build time.
Do these things have like intelligent, will it compile that and cache it so it doesn't like recompile it every time it gets requested and like that too?
Like if you're doing HMR or something, or you mean like when you're deploying?
Like an example of your
yeah.
So you have some templating in there, and like does it just render itself, or does it compile itself
right
on startup and then it just serves that out as a static asset?
I think the way it works is you have to actually declare that you want to build it when you deploy. So I think when you deploy your app, it'll say, hey,
does it build?
Build time is going to say these pages don't need any real-time data. So it's just going to build HTML pages. And then of course, coming back to my subtitle, this is what you get. When we're actually quantifying the outcome of the work that we're doing, you get these beautiful 100 scores across the board where you can say, I did my job well. And this is going to be so hard to do if you're trying to do it from scratch with piecing together all of these disparate packages. All right. So we got two parts, 1 and 2. And now we're going to get weird. Any questions about SSR? Want to talk about the API or any of the stuff that we've seen here? Anyone on the phone? Nobody? Cool. All right. Right. Here we go. It's going to get a little weird, but if you hang on, I think this is going to be both amusing and it's actually going to be worth it. So Whitting was talking about... Sorry. This question's obviously popped up a bunch in Slack. Apparently, this went on at Bright Cove for like 2 years.
At least.
All right. So this is actually shockingly relevant to software architecture. I'm going to dive in a little bit. It's going to get a little weird. Hang on. I promise you it will be worth it. If it's not, then I apologize in advance. Okay. This question in itself is called postmodernism. When I referred to tech as the postmodern hellscape, it was kind of funny and it got a chuckle from the room, but it actually meant something really specific. I'm not going to dive into it. Is anyone here even remotely familiar with postmodernism as a post-Enlightenment French movement of authors? Probably not. It's what I expected. Generally sounds terrible. And you kind of ask yourself, like, who even cares about this? So I'm going to introduce 3 people here. We have this guy. This guy's an 18-year-old stoner who exists in the dorm room. He's pretty much stoned all of the time, in the morning, at night, when he goes to class. Paradoxically, an adept and pedantic student who has a good GPA, but this guy sits in his room all day long and reads esoteric French authors post-Enlightenment. This guy loves postmodernism. Then we have this guy. This guy is a 28-year-old hotel room dwelling hipster musician who dreams of utopia, and he's 10 years early to the Bernie Sanders revolution. he's somewhat skeptical of postmodernism. And then we have this guy. If you look closely, this guy is completely covered in human urine. This guy is a disgruntled 38-year-old suburbia dwelling dad covered in human urine at 7:30 who just spent the last 8 hours smashing his head against the wall, reverse engineering someone's React Redux SPA. He's not happy. He seriously hates postmodernism. All right. So these three people spread over 20 years have very different ideas over how they feel about this stuff. And so right now you're probably thinking like, yeah, this is kind of funny. I have absolutely no idea what you were talking about. So we're going to try and tie it back to software engineering and explain exactly what the postmodern hellscape is. This is deconstruction in practice. When the question is a burger or a sandwich, essentially what we're doing is there is no such thing as a burger or a sandwich, right? These are like human constructions that are built off consensus. There's no burger tree. We're not debating like the atomic number of helium. It's just a thing that we kind of made up that requires consensus that we all kind of do and we all perform it, right? And so because we made it up, we can debate and negotiate the boundaries of the thing because it's not real in like a deterministic sense. So that's why this is fun. We get to, essentially what we're doing is we're negotiating what a burger is and what a sandwich is. And it's super funny, or most people think this is funny. Some people are like seriously unamused by this, and it's something they would rather have not in the Slack channel on a routine basis. But I think it's funny, and I think a lot of people here think it's funny until it stops being funny. And you say, okay, well, when does this stop being funny? Let's talk about postmodernism and law. All right, I'm going to start auctioning off grog burgers here. Or to people who are on the phone, if they get this right, they're probably not talking. We'll give out a burger, move to McDonald's or Be Good or something. So here's the first trivia question. Does anyone know why this question, is a Pringle a potato chip, is relevant?
There's a patent law or something around it.
Close.
Taxes, tariffs.
Actually mashed up potatoes and then reformed in a mold.
Well, okay, but so these are questions about whether or not a Pringles potato chip, but why does it matter?
Did we allowed to call it a chip?
Close. Getting there. This is good. Keep guessing.
There was a legal fight.
Oh, he's getting there.
Ruled that like you did it.
Yes, this man just won a grog burger. All
I think
right,
it's considered a cookie.
here we go. There's a value-added tax of like 17% in Britain on potato chips, and in the infinite wisdom of Pringles lawyers, they decided that they wanted to sue, and they were sued for $160 million. In their argument, you can't make this up, said Pringles are only 42% potato, and they have a shape not found in nature, therefore they do not have the quality of potato-ness. This is a lawyer for Pringles who argued this, and he won! They won! Ultimately, they lost.
42.
What's that?
Only 40.
42%, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of other stuff. Now, ultimately, they lost on appeal, but this is the point. What we all know is that the lawyer at Pringles does not care about the sanctity of the definition of a potato chip. He just doesn't want to pay taxes, right? We all know that. But what postmodernism does with language is sort of chips away at the consensus over what a thing is so that we can like advance some ulterior motive. Here's another example. This is the Sistine Chapel. This is a banana with duct tape. I think most people remember this news story, right? All right, here's the trivia question. The second grog burger. Who knows how much money was paid for the duct tape banana?
Like 500,000.
Wrong. Anyone else guess?
100.
It's close.
150.
I'm going to give it to the 100. It's like Price is Right. You didn't bust. Grog burger goes to the man. $120,000 for a banana with duct tape. And this is the best part. They interviewed the couple that paid for it, and this is what they said. This is the unicorn of the art world. And their intention was to eventually donate it, keep that in your mind, while we replace the fruit every 2 days in order to keep it right. So how are you going to donate a banana that replaces every 2 days? You donate it, and the next day they got to throw it out and just buy their own, right? It defies rational explanation that two people have enough money to waste. They think that this thing is worth $120,000.
They're not buying that, they're buying the idea.
They're buying the idea, the metaphysical idea of a banana with duct tape, not the actual banana or the duct tape. Okay. This is where we're going to tie it all together. This is what postmodernism looks like in software. Third and final grog burger. Anyone know who this guy is? All right. His name's Guillermo Rauch, and he is a core contributor to Zeit, and he works on Nuxt. Now, obviously, I just spoke glowingly of Next.js, right? So this thing's great. You should use this instead of building a single page application. So you would think, I think that this guy is great. I don't. This is his quote. He wrote a blog called 2019 Wrap Up, and this is what he said, and I almost hit the ceiling in my bedroom. The word native has always bothered me. No one can seem to agree on a definition, but we always agree that native apps are optimal. Many people are quick to write off attempting to write a desktop app or mobile app in JavaScript on the basis it's not native. Sometimes the word is used to indicate that JS can't compile down to an executable binary that's native to the platform. I propose the following alternative definition of native, and then he makes his own definition. This is JavaScript thought leading in a nutshell, right? I don't think that Guillermo cares about the meaning of the word native any more than the lawyer at Pringles cares about the meaning of the word potato chip. He's an open source contributor who's trying to advance open source libraries working on, and he thinks it'd be super cool if we just did stuff in Electron and JavaScript and didn't have to go through the gatekeepers of Android or iOS. It's the same strategy, and once you see it, you can't not see it, and then you can know like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't trust this person. So let's bring it all back to the sandwich, and I'm going to guide us out of the hellscape. We have this question, right? This is what we're really asking. This is the ontological matrix of the sandwich. This is really important. For anyone on the phone, anyone's right here, the next 3 slides are the absolute most important thing I'm ever going to say while I work at this company. If you ignore everything I've ever said and everything I say after this, if you pay attention to the next 3 slides, this will be the only thing of any value I think I can really contribute to Rocket Insights. There's 2 axes to this thing, right? We have the ingredient axis that goes from purity to rebellion, and then we have the structural axis that goes from purity to rebellion. And when you look at this, you can kind of map out where you sit. So everyone kind of look at this and say, well, you could be an ingredient purist where you're like, well, sandwich got to have meat and cheese and condiments and all this sort of stuff. And you could be a structural rebel where you're like, if you put all that stuff in a wrap, it's still a sandwich as far as I'm concerned. Same sort of thing. You could be a structural purist, but you can put, ingredient rebellion in there and you stick like an ice cream thing between 2 waffles and you call that a sandwich. And then way, way down to the bottom right corner, there's a Pop-Tart and we should just call that hell. That's hell, right? So here's the question to the room. How many people have at least one dimension, either ingredient or structural purity? Think of what you think a sandwich is. How many people have at least one dimension of purity? All right. How many people, if you got a hot dog, say, that's a sandwich? All right. Brandon thinks a hot dog's a sandwich. Brandon is a chaos mongol. Right?
If you just open the bottom of that bun, that thing's a sandwich.
All right. There we go. And so Brandon's, what we say is structurally neutral and ingredient neutral. And then we go way out there. Who thinks a Pop-Tart's a sandwich? Anybody? Right. That's absolute ingredient rebellion, absolute structure rebellion. And so this seems kind of funny, but this is the point. This 2-dimensional understanding of the boundaries of something like that we're building as human beings, this is universal. It has nothing to do with sandwiches. You can do this with a song. It's like, well, what's the structure of a song? If you're a purist, it's going to be 3 to 5 minutes long. It's going to have a verse, chorus, and a bridge. And, it's whatever. This is the structure. And you can go to ingredient rebellion where you don't need keys. You can be banging pots and pans and whatever, right? You can do this with pretty much anything. So this is where it ties into software. And this is really important. Oh,
The burger wasn't on.
Well, that's you're right. The burger wasn't on there. So the question is, where does the burger fit in here? And I think that we would say the burger it's structural purity and ingredient neutrality, maybe?
Yeah.
Somewhere in there? I don't know what that thing is. It looks like a French fries with ketchup between bread. It looks terrible.
That's what it is.
Is that what it is? Yeah, it looks horrible. All right.
A chip buddy.
A chip buddy. All right. So this is the nucleus of the whole talk, and this is where it comes together. When we're debating burgers and sandwiches, this is like arbitrary. It doesn't really matter. But if you work in a practice that actually has like the need for predictable outcomes, if you're in like science, technology, engineering, mathematics, biology, clinical psychology, if you're like a dentist or a plumber, anything that actually needs predictable outcomes, when you look at these 2 dimensions from ingredient purity to ingredient rebellion and structural purity to structural rebellion, This is your risk matrix. When the further you move out to the either dimension of rebellion, the way greater the likelihood that you're not going to be able to predict the quality of your outcomes. So we have our sort of sandwich thing, and now we've abstracted out into a risk matrix. And now we're going to do web applications. So we have ingredient purity to ingredient rebellion. We have structural purity to structural rebellion. This is what it looks like. On the horizontal dimension of ingredient purity, the most conservative ingredient purists would say, look, I only write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and like web components. And then you get to ingredient neutrality. You're like, all right, well, I'll use Reactive View or Angular Core, maybe Svelte or jQuery. I need some utility functions, so we'll throw in Lodash or Moment because we don't have good data APIs. All right, now you're in kind of, it's a little bit warmer. You're in the yellow zone. And then you get out to ingredient rebellion. This is where like TypeScript, Flow, Elm, all of the Redux stuff, CSS and JS, all this sort of stuff. That's like way out there in ingredient rebellion. And then you flip over to the other axis and we have structural purity to structural rebellion. Structural purity, traditional web application, somewhere in the world, Prince Pace smiling right now, where you have routing, fetching, and rendering that happens on the server. And then you get to the neutrality where you're like, all right, well, we do a lot of routing and fetching, rendering on the server, but we also have a bunch of client-side stuff that happens too, so a little bit warmer. And then way down the bottom, you have structural rebellion. You have single-page apps, Electron, React Native Web, all this other stuff. So, right. So this is the question. I want everyone to take a step back and think of the apps that you've worked on over the last 2 years. And think of the stacks that have been used in those apps. And as you're thinking about it, I want you to place it in the risk matrix.
I'm not putting mine in your risk matrix. I disagree with the placement of a lot of these things, but I don't disagree with the concept. I also think it's more than two-dimensional.
That's true. So we could, there are more dimensions to it if we had 3 more hours.
Yeah.
This is a cursory view of how this works, but just for the sake of argument, let's just say that this is objectively true and I am right. For the sake of argument. here's my question. Right. All right. So how many people have worked on at least one app that is in the red? That means that you build a single page app or React Native Web, Electron, and it's used like React View or Angular Core, or even going further into Ingredient Rebellion, TypeScript, Flow, CopyScript, and all of that sort of stuff. CSS and JS, runtime on the client. How many people that have worked in a web app? 100%, right? How many people have built 2 or more apps that have sit in the web in the last 2 to 3 years? I'm on that list. All right. How many people have actually built an app that's in the green?
Long time ago.
No, I'm saying in the last 2 to 3 years, built an app in the green.
One that people would actually use.
Right. So this is the postmodern hellscape, where we are essentially attacking the meaning of words. Like, who's to say what a native app is? When I had a conversation with Ashley, and he was like, we were talking about a client, and we said, well, we can build a native app. And he said, React Native? And he said, native. We just to actually keep the meaning of words, he just took the word native and put it in front of the word native and said native. Because there was ambiguity over what we're even talking about, right? That is the postmodern hellscape. So I guess when I'm looking here, I'm saying, look, if we're spending most of our time in like the orange or red, we are in a state of almost absolute chaos where when you go from company to company to company or app to app, the likelihood that you're going to be able to predict the quantifiable outcomes you're working that you're going to get through like Lighthouse or something like that is very, very, very low. You'll have no idea whether or not you're going to succeed because you're always reinventing the wheel. Way down in this corner, this is when I come back to Guillermo, who's working on Nuxt. We need people who are sitting in the red. Sitting in the red is the place where it's creative, it's experimental. You're trying new things. You're trying to figure out what the new APIs are going to be. We need people to be there. And that's why I'm glad that he exists. But they need to be in a box, in a closet somewhere. And every now and then they'll come back and we'll quantify what they give us, as we've done with Nuxt here, and made a determination whether or not they're actually doing something helpful or whether they're just being counterproductive. All of us are sitting in the red. And so we're just like cowboys, like just shooting from the hip, doing whatever we want because there's no consequences yet. So ultimately the point is this. to the degree possible, we should really stop trying to reward people for courting insanity and installing any single thing that gets mentioned on Twitter on a near daily basis, and start to think about rewarding people that act responsibly, that actually quantify their outcomes, that give their lighthouse scores, that actually worry about real metrics that show whether or not they've done their job. In conclusion, this is what Ian has to say. What I'm hearing is, don't let front-end devs write real code. Scott O'Brien, that's me quoting Ian, imaginarily quoting me. Principe says, well, I think it's more, don't let front-end devs write back-end code on the front end to avoid having to deal with the back end, which I think is also kind of accurate. And Ian says, I like mine better, makes Scott seem more edgy. Yeah. So I kind of agree with all that. It is kind of what I'm saying, but really what I'm saying is this. Seriously, rule number one, do not trust thought leaders. They're experimenters, and that's great, and we need them, but they don't do what we do. We have to deliver real solutions. We're not selling workshops. And so we shouldn't just listen to whatever they say, because they're experimenters. They're like the Frank Zappas of software. It's like some of the stuff might be brilliant. A lot of it's crap. We need to be able to draw that distinction. We don't just eat up with the spoon everything they pump out there, right? Second thing, to the degree possible, for the love of all that is holy, route, fetch, and render on the server. Doesn't matter whether you're doing a traditional application or an SSR application, do that as much as possible. Rule number three, get those lighthouse scores going, quantify your output. Like if you think you did something good, facts. We want facts to show that you've done a good job. And barring any debate about whether or not my risk matrix is objectively true, I would suggest you should really, really, really try to stay in the green or the yellow. If you're going to go in the orange on some random weekend where you have nothing to do and you want to try out new stuff, cool. Maybe you're a functional programming nut and you want to play around with Elm, have at it. But using that for clients, probably not a good idea. And I would seriously suggest if you're doing a serious application with a diverse user base that needs to scale and live for years, never go to the red. And that's it. So, opinions, questions, disagreements. Sounds like we have at least one disagreement on the risk matrix. I'm going to walk back there. So this to my mind, now there is some debate. There wouldn't be a debate if there wasn't a debate, right? The nature of this thing is that we're all kind of trying to figure out what good is. In the same way we're trying to figure out what a sandwich is. So I guess my question is, I am kind of curious if anyone has any misgivings about how I quantify the risk here. I think you have some opinions, right?
I just think it's more complicated. I don't want to turn it into a big thing, but I do think it's more complicated, and it's not as simple as adding an axis. It's more about measuring. You don't need to worry about mobile. If you don't need to worry about accessibility, and I know that's a big asterisk on it,
right.
But if you're building this literally for a small team of 35 people and they're going to be using it, then you're talking about different problems than this whole thing is about.
Right.
So that's all I was getting at there. But I do think it's interesting to actually slice this up. I like a new structure and ingredients here, but I'm curious of what other way we can slice this. I think what's funny here is actually there's a lot of frameworks that are, I think a lot of this is about framework opinionation. So you get something like Rails or Ember on the client side, which are very opinionated. And I feel like those are going to give you when you were talking about quantifiable outcomes.
Right.
You're going to get more predictably quantifiable or more predictable outcomes anyway from something that is more structured. So I'm kind of curious to see where something like that would fall on here. Like Backbone and Ember and those sorts of front end frameworks on a spectrum. That I think is more interesting to me in this context than sort of just putting React Native and fetching, rendering, and routing on the server sort of on the same axis.
Right.
I feel like they're related.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So I think what's my perspective is that I'm thinking not about the framework wars. I'm trying to almost transcend that and just think about architecture, right? So to me, it's if you're using React Core, Vue Core, Angular Core, any of those things, I actually think that doesn't really matter. It's there's an argument for the whole just JavaScript TM React approach, and there's the argument for the Ember full service framework approach. I think those are all arguments to be had in good faith. I think that's the area where taste and preference can comfortably reside, right? And so the thing I'm thinking about is like, if your user doesn't largely care, then it's probably not something that needs to be elevated to this level, right? It's like your user really doesn't care whether they're using React or Vue. They just want to make sure the thing works. But they seriously do care about how long it takes to load the app, right? And so I think that's where I kind of come to this sort of client-server dimension of the thing, where it's like, if you want to use Svelte, I think that's great. It's kind of experimental, but it's like if you were throwing that up on a single page, and then you had other pages where you're using jQuery, let's say you were fragmented that much that you had like multiple server pages and one of those was like Vue Core and one was Svelte. That is an architecture that would scale because you could just abandon one of those routes and just throw up another one. It doesn't compromise the integrity of the whole thing. The submarine doesn't sink, you know? Put the dog to sleep. Any other opinions or comments?
Can you go back to the next slide?
The Next.js slide?
We actually had like a list. We had like a 4 things to remember.
Oh, my 4 rules, yeah.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah. I don't know. I think like even it's just kind of much more of a nitpicky thing.
Yeah.
But you can kind of put like rules where you're like right like number 1. Just kind of like let that kind of guide you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of like the most important of like, all of these things. It's like actually knowing you can quantify, and all the other excuses kind of fall away at that point.
That's a good point. I mean, I think I actually agree with you. Like I think the thing that's tough is that like what we all know is that before Lighthouse, which I don't stop talking about because it's the only thing that seems to represent objective reality. Like if you ask someone, is your app good? They're gonna be like, yeah, it's good. It's just like their subjective perspective on their own app, right? So I think it's almost hard to elevate it to rule 1 because we don't even really have any basis. Like we don't have permits that we pull. We're not licensed. We're just kind of doing whatever the hell we want.
Well, it's really about access to users, right?
Yeah.
All this is like sort of in the name of science. Like, all right, test it, build it, test it, repeat, and have a tight loop.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if you have access to the users, that's one thing, but like that's difficult to say when you have like a really large potential user base, potentially very varied, and also there's built-in biases there where you're like, well, we don't have any IE users, and maybe that's just because you have shit experience on IE, right? So like,
Right.
there are those sorts of things that happen. But I think if you have access to users and you find out that you can use sort of all the stuff that sits, sort of in that red fiery hellscape or whatever, and like have a gigantic bundle that literally only renders a list and people are still happy, then it's like, well, are you happy writing that code?
Right.
That's the next question, I guess.
Or if it's like those clients, if you don't even really care if it takes that long, and not gonna like hop away.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's where we get into like almost the monopoly problem, right? Where it's like if everyone's starving, then people don't even know they're starving because everyone's starving, right? It's like it's almost like is the quality of a user experience a matter of self-report, or is it something that exists independently of how people feel? Like maybe my 72-year-old mother has nothing to do with her time and is perfectly happy to wait like 30 seconds for a web page to load. Or she doesn't have a choice. I don't think that quality is in the eye of the beholder. I think that we need to aspire to something like outside of that. We need to aspire to something objective. I think that's the problem where it's like, you brought up an interesting point where you're talking about, well, what if we have a relatively small user base? We talked about in the podcast, it was like, what if it's B2B and everyone has MacBooks and no one's blind? And we can kind of throw all these asterisks on. And I think the question is, where do we start? Do we start off the assumption of scale? And do we start off the assumption that we need to account for everybody? Or do we start at the place where we're only focusing on the immediate users that we know we're dealing with right out the gate and then go backwards from there? And I think it's way harder to start at the place where you say, I'm going to install all this stuff and do whatever I want and then unravel it. That's way harder than saying, let's assume that we need to write accessible performant code and then make concessions going like kind of forward from there. I think that to me is the strategy that I deploy anyway.
I'm ready for you, Scott. I'm ready.
Who's that?
Davo.
Dave. Oh boy. I was hoping you weren't here.
All right. So this is only because you're Scott, but
I love it already.
So I think your talk, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I agree in general, but I think the argument is completely user experience facing. My old CTO came up with the concept of like the pillars of engineering, where the most important is maintainability. There's other things like performance and defect free, and I forget if I said maintainability. What's the other one? I guess it doesn't really matter, but to him, the most important thing is maintainability over even performance or
user experience or accessibility, whatever it is, right?
Yeah. So it's like some of these things, I haven't used Nuxt, but I use Nuxt, and I found so many bugs that I just have to work around, which actually aren't completely solvable by me. I can kind of hack around and make it mostly work. And I mean, I think like the user actually like can suffer in some circumstances where like if we spend all of our time trying to maintain something that is more complex because now it has another server component to it, that means we can't put out a new feature. So sometimes that's not necessarily worth it to the business. If you can make 3 features or 1 and it's like a faster load time, the business might often choose the 3 features.
All right, so I'm gonna answer your comment with a question.
That was kind of all over the place, but I think you know what I'm saying.
I know exactly what you're saying. So here's my question, Dave-O.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is any relationship between maintainability of an app and the velocity of a team and the quantifiable quality of the user experience outcome? Are those things independent or are they married to one another?
I don't think they're necessarily married, but I think they, in theory, should be related, because that means you have more changes. If you're getting the user feedback in the same, like at the same pace, that means you can make more iterations. So it's like, you have more opportunities to change or like improve the UX. Right.
Because this is my theory. I don't have any proof for this, but my assumption is that maintainability and team velocity will organically emerge from prioritizing user outcomes. Like if your team is focused on quantifying the quality of the user outcomes, you will have a code base that is maintained, because the regulating mechanism of good code is what it does. And so I suppose hypothetically that might not be true. Like I can imagine that you have some app that has this incredible user experience. There's a total dumpster fire behind the scenes. I don't know. Does anyone think about that? That seems like it's unlikely to me. It seems unlikely that you have a spaghetti dumpster fire of code that somehow is optimal user experience. Anyone think that's possible?
I mean, honestly,
I think it's possible, yeah.
When we're on that project, and their product was really pretty beautiful, but it was a fucking dumpster fire behind the scenes. Like, I do think that the UX there was incredible, but I think they prioritized it in a way where they did a lot of like really advanced, really difficult to do things.
Yeah.
And they took that path, but the result was a code base that was just like 10x the size of anything.
Right.
Costing, right? Like it's like, yes, you can make it a good user experience, and it can be extremely complicated, but like that's going to increase costs. There's increased possibility of bugs. Most likely performance implications. To me, the thing that's interesting is from the top left to the bottom right, it's like things that are two pieces that are decoupled, back end, front end, and then take all of that, just put it in one place on the front end, and then the compromise is like, okay, 3 things, but you compartmentalizing the different pieces. So the front end and the user experience is one piece, the kind of the routing and this kind of local server stuff is another piece, and then kind of the traditional server stuff. Like making it more complicated by having 3 larger pieces instead of either 2 or 1, those pieces themselves can be simpler. So you can kind of be more focused in specific areas instead of kind of the single page app. Let's stick all this crap in one place. It's all the same. Yes, only one, like you can now just do it in all JavaScript, but like, do you really want to be doing all of this stuff in one place?
Right.
And conflating all these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of addition to my point. Like businesses will always have like their own priorities. So like hosting something like this will cost more money because you just need more servers because the servers have to render things, you know, and AWS is not actually cheap. So, I mean, it just depends on the business and where it's at.
It could potentially be cheaper than, having another engineer, have to deal with more complex code. If you can reduce the complexity of your code.
Where do you want to put your costs for the company, right? On server infrastructure or more people trying to grind JavaScript?
Yeah, definitely. It's a trade-off.
Versus having more infrastructure, but it simplifies your code.
Right. Because you can keep on buying more servers and buying people is way harder, right?
Like that question literally could be based off of like where your company is located and how much you have to pay people.
Right. I mean, the thing I was thinking about is that when I look at this stuff, I think of it the same way I think about accessibility. I think Adam's the only person who's actually had to go like full accessibility, and he's talked in his lightning talk about how hard it is. I've never done that. I just try to like hit like just at a surface level analysis, make sure I'm hitting my lighthouse scores and that I don't have anything flagrantly wrong. But it's sort of interesting when I look at totally non-semantic DOMs that are just divs from top to bottom. And I kind of feel the same way where I'm like, those DOMs, they're like less semantic, less accessible, and so deeply nested that when I say like, yeah, we should write accessible code, I usually hear like, oh, it's so much harder and there's all this work and we don't have time. And I'm just like, wait a minute, like, look at this DOM. I can't even read this thing, So I almost feel like, I think that like the best user experience, the best number of people will write less code and will write cleaner code. And then we can scale the infrastructure by just buying servers and stuff, I mean, that's sort of my ethos. No, if anyone really knew the answer to this question, we wouldn't even be having the talk. So clearly there's no hard and fast answer that we should all just do this thing, except for Prince Lee. He thinks we just use Rails. But minimally, I'd like to think we can all agree that like what we're doing right now is seriously not going to be something that we can continue doing in perpetuity in the future. We need to have some standards that we all agree upon. We can't just be doing whatever we want. I think that's like the minimum possible takeaway. Can't be the Wild West where we're at Shift and they're just like, hey, Dan Mabrov mentioned this thing, install tomorrow. You're like, oh, what is happening, right? Cowboys and cowgirls.
Remember when hooks came out and they said, don't migrate to them, and then everyone did?
When what came out?
Hooks.
Great.
Hooks are not great.
You guys don't get it.
Here we go. Back around again. Start over again. Hot news.
Let's deconstruct hooks.
Yep. That's all I have. Any other opinions from the phone or anyone else want to weigh in or tell me I'm completely full of shit?
I like the message that you should be like starting from the best possible like sort of metrics, but like accessibility, get all this stuff like out of the gate. I think there's a lot of trade-offs to be made, and there's a lot of different dimensions that need to be weighed. Like, has the company like actually figured out what the user wants, right? Like, how much is this thing going to change? Is it maintainable, et cetera? I think we can weigh and like deal with all those things in so many different environments, right? I think that's part of what being an engineer is like, well, all right, this is it. We'll make that work, right? And I think if you start with the right approach, or an approach that's not too constraining and not going to make those, the other aspects that you were talking about as like extremely challenging or even more challenging, and that's a good place to begin.
One more thought, my final thought. This is a conversation you and I were having like 2 weeks ago. And one of the things I was saying is how we've inverted the incentive structure where developers were sort of prioritized on like developer experience and not like user experience. And Adam and I were having this conversation because we were just kind of looking at the what's the name of the app you're working on? And I was saying how like, and he was showing me like just the insane amount of complexity he's doing with all of this like visualizations and all these charts and everything, this genetic mapping, all this like seriously heavy client side stuff, right? For user interactions, everything. And we were talking, I said like the $50,000 check example, right? It's like, if I slap a $50,000 check on the table, and this can go to anyone, think of the app you're working on right now and the amount of client side code you're writing. If I put a check for $50,000 on the table and I call it a developer bonus, and I said, can't work overtime. You have to reduce your client side footprint by 90%. You can't cut any features, and you can work with the design team to make some product changes. If you do that, you get the $50,000 check. I think what we all know is like, you will find a way. You will find a way to get that done and you will succeed. we don't have that incentive right now. None of us are actually, we're not like salesmen. We don't actually get incentivized on outcomes. So why would we even bother doing it? No one cares. No one holds us accountable. And so in my head, I imagine that check's out there. I'm like, that check is there. That's my hierarchy. Like if I can just reach that check. And so if you put that as your mental model, it's like, well, if I was properly incentivized, how good could this be without compromising anything, including my time? And I think you would all of a sudden see way more performance just organically come out of apps that cut nothing. That's my hypothesis. So imagine that. Imagine if you're a developer and you get like a $5,000 check at the end of the month if you improve performance 10%. I'd like to live in that world. I'd be like to be a incentivized developer because right now we just, we're like we're not like car salesmen. We're just, like a commodity or whatever. We just kind of pump this stuff out and collect our paycheck, and unless someone screams, everything's kind of fine, right?
That was an uplifting end.
Yeah. So there we have it. I guess that's it. Thank you for everyone on the phone. I hope you enjoyed yourself and it wasn't completely boring.
All right. Thanks, everyone.